On a cold spring night in 1914, a great ocean liner was steaming down a wide Canadian river toward the open Atlantic, outward bound for Liverpool. There were nearly 1,500 people on board. Most of them were asleep in their cabins, below the deck. Out of a bank of fog, a heavy ship loaded with coal came on and struck her in the side. 14 minutes later, the liner had rolled onto her side and sunk to the bottom of the river. There had been almost no time at all. 1,012 people died that night. Among them were 840 passengers. That is more passengers than died on the Titanic, just 2 years before. And yet, almost no one remembers her name. She did not go down on a glamorous Atlantic crossing, but in a quiet river in Canada, in the dark, in the narrow gap of time between the Titanic and a world war. In an earlier episode, we told the story of a disaster that killed more than the Titanic, and was erased from memory by a single greater piece of news. Tonight is another. This is the story of the Empress of Ireland, and of 14 minutes on the St. Lawrence River. The Empress of Ireland was an ocean liner of the Canadian Pacific Company, built in Scotland in 1906. She was a handsome ship, around 570 feet long, with 2 tall funnels and the comfortable elegance of the great Edwardian liners. She was not a record-breaker, and she was not famous. She was something more ordinary and more useful. A reliable workhorse of the North Atlantic, carrying passengers and mail back and forth between Canada and Britain, year after year. Her route ran between Quebec City and Liverpool. 6 days across the ocean, and then the long, sheltered run up or down the St. Lawrence River, between the Canadian shores, at the start and end of every crossing. On the 28th of May, 1914, she left Quebec City on another of those crossings, bound for Liverpool. On board were 1,477 people. Just over 1,000 were passengers. The rest were her crew. They were a cross-section of the age. Wealthy travellers in the first-class cabins, families and workers and emigrants in second and third. And one large group with a particular purpose, travelling together. Nearly 170 of them were members of the Salvation Army, including most of its Canadian staff band, on their way to a great international congress in London. They were musicians and officers and their families, and they had boarded the Empress full of anticipation. As the evening of the 28th wore on, the great liner moved down the widening river toward the sea. The passengers settled into their cabins for the night. The ship was warm, the river was calm, and there was no reason to expect anything but an ordinary crossing. In the small hours of the morning, the Empress of Ireland was well down the river, near the town of Rimouski, approaching the point where the St. Lawrence finally opens out into the Gulf and the sea beyond. She had dropped her river pilot and was making her own way out. The night was clear enough at first, and ahead of her, the lights of another ship could be seen, coming up the river toward her. There was plenty of room, and plenty of time. That other ship was the Storstad, a Norwegian vessel built to carry coal, low and heavy in the water with 11,000 tons of it in her holds. Crucially, her bow was reinforced, strengthened to push through river ice. She was, in effect, a blunt steel ram. The two ships saw each other's lights and understood each other's positions. In open, clear water, it would have been a routine passing. But the river had one more thing to add to the night. A bank of fog came rolling off the land and across the water, the way it often does on the St. Lawrence. And as it closed over the two ships, they lost sight of one another completely. Each was now a sound in the dark to the other, somewhere out in the grey. This is the moment on which everything turned, and the moment that has been argued over ever since. In the blinding fog, the two ships sounded their whistles to signal their intentions. But somewhere in that exchange, their picture of where the other ship was, and which way it was heading, went badly wrong. Each captain believed he understood the other. Each acted to pass safely. And out of that misunderstanding, in the fog, the two ships were now closing on the same patch of black water, instead of sliding safely past. For a few minutes there was nothing but the fog, the whistles, and the slow engines. And then, suddenly, out of the grey, the bow of the Storstad appeared, close, and pointed straight at the side of the Empress. There was no time to turn away. At just before 2 in the morning, the reinforced steel bow of the coal ship drove into the starboard side of the Empress of Ireland, near the middle of the hull, and bit deep below the waterline. It tore a great wound in her side, low down, in the worst possible place. Through that hole, the cold river began to pour into the ship at an enormous rate, thousands of tons of water in the first minute alone. The Storstad herself did not sink. Her crumpled bow held, and she stayed afloat. But she pulled back and away, and the hole she left behind in the Empress was open to the river, deep in the hull, on a ship full of sleeping people. On the bridge of the Empress, the captain tried to do the one thing that might have saved her. He tried to drive his ship toward the nearby shore, to run her aground in the shallows before she could sink. But the water was already winning. The flooding was simply too fast. Within moments, the engines were drowned and the lights began to fail, and the great liner started to lean over toward the wounded side, toward the starboard, where the river was pouring in. And as she leaned, a second, quieter disaster was already working against her, one built into the warm and ordinary comfort of the night before. It was a mild night, and the river was sheltered, so all over the lower decks, many of the small round portholes had been left open, to let air into the cabins while the passengers slept. As the Empress listed further onto her side, those open portholes, rows of them down the length of her, dipped below the surface of the river. And through every one of them, more water began to flood into the ship. It is one of the cruelest details of the whole story. The very openings that had made the night comfortable now became dozens of extra wounds, pulling the ship down faster, on top of the great hole the Storstad had already made. The watertight doors that might have contained the flooding could not all be closed in time. And the way the ship was built meant the water gathering on the starboard side did not spread to balance her. It simply pulled that side down, harder and harder. Below decks, the passengers woke to chaos. A sudden, steep tilt of the floor. The lights going from bright, to dim, to dark. Cold water already coming along the corridors. And almost no time to understand what was happening. Those who were near a stairway, who were quick, who were strong, who were lucky enough to be high in the ship, had a chance to scramble up toward the open deck. Those who were deep inside the hull, in an inside cabin, in the dark, mostly did not. From the moment of the collision, the Empress of Ireland had only about 14 minutes left, and she spent most of them rolling over, faster and faster, onto her side. The speed of the list defeated almost every attempt to save her people. The lifeboats on the high port side, swinging in over the deck, could not be launched at all. Only a handful of boats on the low starboard side got away. People who reached the open deck found it tilting under them like a roof. They clung to railings and fittings, and as the ship went over, many of them simply slid or were thrown down the steepening steel and into the river. And then, only minutes after the collision, the Empress of Ireland rolled completely onto her side. For a short while she lay there, half out of the water, with hundreds of people crawling over her exposed hull in the dark. And then she was gone. The great liner slipped under the black surface of the St. Lawrence and sank to the river bed, taking with her almost everyone who had still been trapped inside. From the collision to the end, about 14 minutes had passed. The arithmetic of those minutes is brutal. Most of the passengers had been asleep, below decks, when the river came in. They had no time to climb, no clear way up, and no second chance. The crew, awake and on duty and near the boats, survived in far greater numbers than the people they carried. The cost fell hardest on those least able to fight their way out. Of the more than 300 women on board, only a few dozen lived. And of the 138 children on the Empress of Ireland, just 4 survived. The Salvation Army Band and their families, who had boarded so full of purpose, were almost wiped out. Of the nearly 170 who had sailed, only 8 lived. Most of the Canadian staff band would never reach their congress in London. In the space of a quarter of an hour, on a calm river within sight of land, more passengers had died than on the Titanic. And the night was not yet over for those left alive in the freezing water. The river was bitterly cold, and it was full of people. Hundreds of survivors were in the water at once, clinging to wreckage, to deck chairs, to one another, in the dark, far from any shore they could reach on their own. Their first rescuer was the ship that had struck them. The Storstad, damaged but still afloat, lowered her own lifeboats into the dark and began pulling people out of the river, as many as she could carry. From the shore, help was coming too. Out of Rimouski and the nearby port, mail boats and small vessels put out into the night and steamed toward the place where the lights of the Empress had been just minutes before. They worked through the last hours of darkness, pulling the living, and then the dead, from the cold river. The boats filled with survivors wrapped in whatever could be found, shocked, soaked, and freezing, many having lost their entire families in 14 minutes. When the count was finally made, 465 people had survived, out of 1,477. More than 1,000 were gone, most of them still inside the ship on the river bed. The survivors were brought to Rimouski, and then carried on by train, the living and the recovered dead together, away from the river. For many of them, The journey that had begun as an ordinary voyage home had ended as the worst night of their lives. And out on the St. Lawrence, where it had all happened in a quarter of an hour, the river closed over the wreck and went quiet, as if nothing at all had taken place there. In the weeks that followed, the obvious question was asked. In a wide river, on a night when the two ships had clearly seen each other, how could they possibly have collided? A formal inquiry was held, led by a British commission. It concluded that the fault lay with the Storstad, that the coal ship had changed her course in the fog and turned across the path of the Empress when she should have held steady. But a separate inquiry, held in Norway, reached the opposite conclusion. It cleared the Storstad's officers entirely and laid the blame on the Empress, finding that it was the liner that had altered course in the fog. 2 investigations, 2 verdicts, pointing in opposite directions. More than a century later, exactly who turned the wrong way in that fog has never been settled, and probably never will be. What is certain is only that, between them, the two ships made a fatal mistake. But the deeper question is not who was to blame. It is why a disaster of this size, the worst of its kind in Canadian history, vanished so completely from the world's memory. The answer is mostly a matter of timing. The Empress of Ireland went down just 2 years after the Titanic. The world had already had its great ocean liner tragedy, and this one, in a remote river, felt like a lesser echo of it. And then, only 2 months later, the First World War began. Within weeks, the deaths of 1,000 civilians on a river were swallowed up by the deaths of millions on the battlefields of Europe. The following year, the Lusitania went down, and the Empress sank, a second time, beneath the weight of larger and louder catastrophes. At the Great Congress in London, the Salvation Army left a place open for the band that never arrived. A single Canadian bandsman, one of the few who had not sailed, sat alone where 40 of his comrades should have been. The Empress of Ireland still lies where she sank, on the bed of the St. Lawrence, in about 40 metres of cold and murky water off the Quebec shore near Pointe-au-Père. She is a difficult and dangerous place, and over the years several divers who went down to her have not come back. Today the wreck is a protected site, and her story is kept alive in a museum on the shore nearby, where the recovered artefacts and the names of the dead are carefully preserved. It is one of the few places where the Empress is still remembered at all. More people died on the Empress of Ireland than most of us will ever realize. More passengers than on the Titanic. An entire band, an entire night of families, gone in 14 minutes, on a quiet river, in peacetime. And almost no one knows her name. She is the forgotten Empress, lost not to a famous iceberg or an act of war, but to fog, and bad luck, and the simple cruelty of timing. In our next episode, we stay close to shore, on a bright summer morning, aboard a crowded pleasure steamer full of women and children on a church outing, in the moments before it caught fire. Subscribe, so you don't miss it.